Okay, so on Friday the 17th of November, we finally got the Doctor Who Children in Need sketch that we were promised, which some people have dubbed Destination Skaro. I don't know if that's really the official name of the sketch. I know Russell said Destination Skaro in one of his Instagram captions, but for me personally, it didn't look like he was trying to say that that was the title of this sketch, but people have just kind of ran with that, and I quite like the name of it, so I think that is what people are going to refer to it as in the future, and I don't mind that because I think it is quite a cool title. But yeah, in this video, I just kind of want to discuss my thoughts on this sketch, what I think about it, whether I liked it or not, and just some general discussions about other more specific topics about this sketch, and some slightly controversial things that I don't want to get too deep into, but I do have things to say on it, you know, about Davros and stuff like that, and I also want to talk a little bit about Unleashed as well. Before this sketch aired, people had basically kind of figured out the plot, at least some people I'd seen on like Twitter and stuff had basically figured out what the plot was going to be like, because they could tell it was going to be set like probably before Genesis of the Daleks because of the uniforms and stuff. They could tell it was maybe going to be about the Dalek plunger because the Dalek you can see in the promo image doesn't have its plunger on. And so people kind of figured out that was kind of probably what it was going to be. And so because of that, I was kind of hoping for a little bit more than that, but there wasn't really much more to it than that, besides obviously Davros showing up. But even with that being said, I still liked it, even having figured out basically what it was going to be before it aired. Now, I think some people are taking this a little bit too seriously, and I'm not even talking about the Davros stuff right now, I just mean the sketch in general. Some people were quite disappointed by it, as if this isn't just a Children in Need sketch, which I think is a little bit weird. I know Russell did kind of say in his Instagram caption, you know, this isn't a comedy sketch or whatever, a comedy skit before it aired, which I do feel like it was a little bit weird that he said that, but I don't know, I feel like he was meant to just be kind of joking in some way when he said that, or kind of indicating that it wasn't going to be like the Doctor meeting Pudsey Bear or something like that. But yeah, I do think it was a little bit weird that he said that, and that did kind of affect some people's expectations. But at the end of the day, I still don't know what people are expecting. It's a Children in Need sketch. You shouldn't have had your hopes up too high really for it and thought that it was going to be some really serious thing or something like that. And then I've also seen some people saying that they think this is like an indication of what the whole of the next era is going to be like, and kind of reflects the new era as a whole, and this is the introduction to the new era, which I think is just an insane thing to say, because it's a Children in Need sketch. It's not like the first special of the 60th anniversary or like the first episode of the new era. If you're taking this as an indication of what the next era is going to be like, or the introduction of the new era, I think that's honestly an insane thing to do, because this is a Children in Need sketch. Yes, it happens to be like the first filmed thing that we see with the 14th Doctor, besides this regeneration scene, and like the first filmed thing of the new era, I guess. But that's only because Children in Need happened to come out before the 60th anniversary special started airing, like, and they just wanted to be part of it. If Children in Need aired like the week after the specials, Doctor Who would have still been part of it, and it probably would have still been like the same sort of thing. So if you're taking this as an indication of what the new era is going to be like as a whole, I do think that is like a bit of an insane thing to do, because at the end of the day, it is just like a little funny Children in Need sketch. That's all it is. Like, don't take it too seriously. Okay, so after seeing this nice visual effects shot of the TARDIS kind of flying towards Skaro at the start of the sketch, we then immediately are greeted to Julian Bleach walking in as Davros, which I thought was very cool to see, very unexpected. I did not expect Davros to be in this. I know before it aired, a lot of people were saying they think, oh, maybe we're going to see Davros, and I was thinking, I don't think we are. I think some people were even saying Moan could have been Davros, or saying that he could have been Nyder, and I was like, I don't think that's the case. Moan is definitely just playing a new original character, which was the case. He was playing Castavillian, which is a really funny name, but it was an original character. But I expected it to just be him and David Tennant in it. I didn't think we'd be seeing anybody else. So it was nice to see Julian Bleach return as Davros, and in a different form to how we normally see him, because this is Davros kind of pre-accident, just looking like Julian Bleach with maybe like a little bit of makeup on, instead of how we normally see him, which I thought was really cool. Now, obviously, people have had a lot of things to say about Davros in this. For me, just for this sketch on its own, it makes a lot of sense, because this is pre-Genesis of the Daleks. I know in some people's version of canon that doesn't quite work out, because in some novelizations for Genesis or some expanded media stuff, you know, by this point Davros should already be in the chair or whatever. But we always know the Doctor Who canon is not always set in stone. It changes all the time, and at the end of the day, the way I always think about it is whatever's televised, if it contradicts something from like Expanded Universe or Big Finish or whatever, that trumps whatever the canon was before, because, you know, it's the main show. This is a little bit different because it's Children in Need sketch, but I feel like it's meant to kind of be canon to the main show, because because it's got the same actors in it and stuff. But like I say, Doctor Who canon changes all the time, so I don't think you should be that annoyed by that if the timeline is slightly wrong. But obviously, the main problem a lot of people seem to have with this is the comments RTD made in Doctor Who Unleashed, basically saying that this is how we're going to see Davros from now on because of the whole trope of villain characters often being portrayed as disabled, which obviously is not a good trope. And so I have to say I do agree with Russell on this, and ultimately I do feel like it is the right decision to make. Like I said earlier, it makes sense in this story anyway because it's pre-Genesis of the Daleks, so we can just say, you know, this is before he had the accident, before his like lab explosion or whatever it was that caused him to look like that. So it makes sense for this story, but it will be interesting to see maybe how they work around this in the future. If they even do, they might not even bring him back after this. Maybe that's what Russell meant, is like this is his last appearance and this is how he wants him to be seen. But maybe he will come back. Maybe there'll be more pre-Genesis stories where he looks like this, or you know, maybe in the future they'll just have like an explanation as to why he is healed again. You know, possibly he's got a bit of that regeneration energy left from Series 9 or something like that. Who knows? Maybe it could be the whole story of the next time we see Davros as to why he's looking like this. But ultimately I do think it was the right decision to make, especially with it being aired on children in need. You know, if the whole message of this is we're seeing a lot of like disabled children that we're meant to be raising money for and to help, it would be a little bit insensitive to have Davros show up as a disabled villain in this children in need sketch. So it does definitely make sense for that. But I think the main reason people are annoyed is because Russell has basically hinted that this is how we're going to see him in the future as well, which, like I say, I personally am fine with. I think it's the right decision. It will just be interesting to see how they go about doing that in the future. And I think if this is genuinely something that you're worked up about, I think there's more important things to be worrying about, and you know, go outside and touch some grass. It's not that big of a deal. And like, I've seen some people trying to defend it, being like, I've never seen it as a wheelchair that Davros is in. I've seen it as a life support system. And like, to those people, I just want to say, like, what do you think the word disability means? Do you think it just means somebody in a wheelchair? Like, do you not understand how nuanced disability can be? Whether it's a wheelchair or a life support system, it doesn't change the fact that Davros is disabled. That's still the case either way. If somebody has to move around in a life support system, that's still a disability. It doesn't change anything. So yeah, if this is something you genuinely worked up about, this change that Russell T Davies has made, I don't know what to tell you. Go outside and touch some grass. Anyway, we then get the moment between Davros and Moan's character, where they're trying to use an anagram of Khaled to come up with a name for the Daleks, which I think was quite a funny joke, but it probably was my least favourite joke in this whole sketch, only because I feel like it went on for a tad too long. I did think it was quite funny to begin with, but the more names he just kept putting out there, I did think, okay, we could have probably finished with this joke a couple lines ago or something, but I still thought it was a pretty funny idea. Anyway, Davros is then called away by Nyder, which I think was a really nice cameo.
Davros, I need your confirmation to begin the next bombardment, sir.
I heard it when I was watching it and I thought, is that meant to be Nyder's voice? I was like, it sounds pretty similar, but I don't remember exactly how he sounds. But I've seen a lot of people talking about it afterwards and they clearly say it's meant to be Nyder as well, which I thought was a nice cool cameo. I looked on TARDIS Wiki and it says that was Nick Briggs doing that impression, but there was no source for that particular bit of information, so I don't know how true that is. Anybody who knows for sure, let me know in the comments. But either way, I think it was a really good impression of Nyder and a nice little cameo to have in there. But anyway, the music up to this point in the sketch I thought was quite good. I like the music when it's the scenes with Davros and Castavillian, and I like the initial motif that sounds like The Doctor Forever from what I remember, when the 14th Doctor crash lands and gets out of his TARDIS. Then the music really takes a bit of a turn immediately as it starts getting more into the comedic half of this sketch, and I really don't like the over-the-top clown music that's throughout the rest of this sketch. It sounds really bad, really obnoxious and over the top, and it's maybe like a little bit too loud as well. I think it could have just maybe done without any of the music or a little bit of a different track. Like, we know it's meant to be funny, we don't need this over-the-top clown-like music to tell us that, and like I said, it was just a little bit too obnoxious for me, but the music at the start of the sketch, like I said, was pretty good. And yeah, I think that comedy music playing throughout is basically the only thing I didn't really like about this sketch. But then of course we had David Tennant back as the Doctor, who for the rest of the sketch is playing against Moan Rizwan as Mr. Castavillian, who I think was really good in this. He did admit in Doctor Who Unleashed that he's only seen bits of Doctor Who on and off, but I think he had really good chemistry with David, and I think he was really good in this for what it was. And obviously David Tennant was great as the Doctor, as ever. He seemed a little bit more energetic and eccentric in this compared to how he normally is as the 10th Doctor, but I do think that was mostly just down to this being a children in need sketch, or also maybe a little bit of post-regeneration, because it does seem like he's going to be a lot more serious than this in the specials, with obviously still probably a few little comedic parts, especially with Donna. There's obviously a nice reference to Jodie's Doctor in this as well.
60 minutes ago, I was this really brilliant woman.
And they also have Jodie's interior card in the TARDIS, which makes sense because he's still got that interior in Liberation of the Daleks. Interesting that we don't see an explanation as to how the new TARDIS interior comes about, though, because I don't think we're going to see Jodie's interior during the 60th anniversary specials. Maybe we'll see like the interior card like this, like we did in here, but that does indicate to me that maybe we're going to see an explanation for the new TARDIS interior during the 60th anniversary specials, possibly during Wild Blue Yonder, because the TARDIS does seem to be going a little bit funny in that. But yeah, I also liked the joke of the Doctor accidentally naming the Daleks, especially as a little bit of payoff to that scene earlier on with Davros and Castavillian. The fact that he seems to coin the catchphrase exterminate for the Daleks as well, and also a cheeky little nod to Genesis of the Daleks as well, I thought was quite funny. And speaking of the Daleks, I think the Daleks look great in this. Having the Genesis of the Daleks era Dalek models with these modern HD cameras, I think they look really good. And although Russell has said that he does want to give the Daleks a bit of a rest in the new series, if they do come back in season 2 or series 15, whatever we're calling it, I would be happy with the Genesis era Daleks, or a new redesign that's kind of based on the Genesis era Daleks instead of the Time War Daleks. If they do ever come back, I think that would look really cool. Okay, so the episode opens with a quick fourth wall break-in recap scene with the Doctor and Donna basically explaining what happened at the end of Series 4 and the 2009 specials, which I feel like this scene feels a lot like it was requested by Disney just to kind of catch everybody up, and maybe it wasn't initially in there. I do agree that we needed some sort of recap for some people, especially for people who are just watching it for the first time or haven't watched since Series 4 and can't remember exactly what happened. But I do feel like a more conventional, previously on trailer would have worked a lot better, because this does feel quite weird, especially with the Doctor just floating in space. I do think initially the idea would have probably been to have the Doctor inside the TARDIS or something, because that would have made a lot more sense. But I think they probably just chose not to do that because they didn't want to ruin the TARDIS reveal scene at the end of the episode, so instead they just kind of chose to put him floating in space, which is an interesting choice for the first impression we get of the episode, because it's literally like the first shot basically. Maybe they could have used the green screen to maybe just put in like Jodie's TARDIS or something like that. Obviously it was demolished, but like I say, he's on a green screen anyway, they probably could have put that in the background. So after that recap happens, we're then greeted to the brand new title sequence, which for the most part I quite like the new title sequence. I think the time vortex and TARDIS visuals look really good. I like how they have different cuts and it cuts to different shots of the TARDIS going through the vortex. It feels quite new and different, adds a lot of pace and energy to it, and I like the way the actors' names are revealed in this title sequence as well. However, I do have some problems with this title sequence. Number one being the music is out of sync, which is something that annoyed me way back in Capaldi's era as well, and it does make the title sequence feel way too quick as well, which some people kind of speculated this could be because it's kind of like a cut down version of Ncuti's title sequence for season 1, which I really do hope that is the case, because if this is going to be like basically the exact title sequence we also get for Ncuti's era, it's going to be a little bit annoying. But the main problem I have with this title sequence that I hope is fixed with Ncuti's title sequence as well is the kind of keyframed logo PNG for when the logo shows up at the end of the title sequence, because it just looks really bad. It's clearly just like I said, a PNG of the logo that they've just kind of added some keyframes to, or like a spin transition to, with like no motion blur or anything. And what makes this really annoying for me is we know they have like the assets and the 3D model from the logo reveal video that I feel like they could have just kind of somehow placed in here or adjusted slightly to fit with this title sequence. They do try to add a little bit of flair, making the outline of the Who kind of pop at the end, but it just would have looked a lot better if it was a 3D model like we saw in the logo reveal video, because it's kind of annoying that the logo reveal video makes the logo look better than the actual title sequence itself. So like I said, I hope that's something they change for Ncuti's titles, and that this is just because it's a cut down version of Ncuti's titles. So the first scene we properly get played out pretty much as a lot of us expected from what we saw with filming and some shots in the trailers and stuff. Feels very fast paced. I think there might have been some things cut from this, because I do remember we saw the Doctor using his heads up display and stuff like that on his sonic screwdriver during this scene in the filming. So I feel like some things might have been cut from this, and it does show because it feels very fast paced, but I also kind of don't mind how quickly we get into the action of the episode, because we basically meet Donna and Rose, and we also have the ship crashing within just a couple of minutes of the episode starting. Obviously, Donna misses the whole ship crash, which is very in character for Donna. We then also meet Sean once again, who the Doctor gets into a taxi with to go and find the crashed ship, with a nice little joke with the psychic paper referencing Jodie, and a really funny scene with the Doctor and Sean inside the taxi, which is kind of our first chance to really breathe in the episode, which is really nice. We obviously didn't spend too much time with him in the end of time, because he was more just like showing that this is who Donna's going to marry at the end of the episode. I feel like he might have had some lines in the end of time, but I can't really remember. So it's nice that we get to see a lot more of him him in this, and I think he's great here. He really comes across as a character that's just kind of there along for the ride, not bothered about anything that's going on around him, which makes sense because he's with Donna, who gave away their lottery money. And speaking of the lottery money, I might as well talk about the lottery ticket as well, because I wasn't sure if this was something that was going to get brought up in the episode. If it was, I thought it would just kind of be a passing joke, but it does kind of become quite essential to the plot, as it kind of hints at Donna's memory of the Doctor and the fact that she's still got the metacrisis in her somewhere, influencing her decisions, and shows that her character arc and character development from series 4 hasn't been completely reset. In this episode, we also get to meet Rose Noble, Donna's daughter. There is a scene early on with Rose Noble, who is obviously trans, where she's getting called her dead name by some boys on bikes, which I personally think this was really good, as it shows trans people's lived experiences. But obviously I'm not trans, and I've seen some trans people positive about this and some negative about this, but like I said, for me personally, I think it's good to show because it is a thing that happens to trans people. But if some people have problems with it, that's absolutely fine, and I'm obviously not the person to make that judgment. With that being said though, I do think the moment between Sylvia and Donna is really good, and even better than that moment, because it shows although they make mistakes and find it difficult to remember sometimes, they still clearly love and respect Rose a lot, which is really nice. And speaking of that, Sylvia is really good in this episode. It's nice to see that she's become a lot more kind and supportive after the end of time and Journey's End, trying to distract Donna from discussions about the ship crashing because she doesn't want her to remember the Doctor in case she dies, which continues throughout the episode, pretending that she doesn't know the Doctor and she doesn't name him in case that'll make Donna remember. We then get a moment where the Doctor tries to sneak into the steelworks where the ship has landed, and he uses his sonic to draw this kind of holographic heads-up display, which I speculated would be a thing, which is a new feature of the sonic that I kind of don't mind. I think it's a pretty good feature of the sonic, and it kind of just shows the increased budget of these specials and hopefully the future seasons in this era. But I'll talk more about the sonic later on. The Doctor then meets Shirley Ann Bingham, who I think was great in this episode, and I can't wait to see her in the future. I'm pretty sure she's going to be showing up in later specials and hopefully in Shooty seasons as well. She has a really great moment where the unit soldiers have to go up some stairs to get to the ship, where she says, "Don't make me the problem, just get in there," which is not only good commentary on her disability, but it also works for the plot as well, as it means that she doesn't get hypnotized. Following this, we get the moment where Rose finds the Meep, who's played incredibly by Miriam Margolyes, and the Meep looks great in this episode. Until I saw Doctor Who Unleashed, I thought there was a lot more CGI involved in this, but it's a lot of practical stuff for the Meep, with just a little bit of CGI on top. And once again, you can really see the budget has increased for this new era. We also have a scene where Rose corrects the Doctor on the Meep's pronouns, and the Doctor asks the Meep of the pronouns, which I think was quite well done. I think it's not as clunky as some other lines in this episode, which I will get onto later on. We're then obviously introduced to the Wrath, who are trying to capture the Meep. The first time we heard them speak, I was a little bit unsure at their voices at first, as they just kind of sounded like normal guys with not really any voice effects or anything on top of it, but I did prefer the way they spoke when we hear them in the court scene later on. Whilst they're in Donna's house looking after the Meep, we get a little scene with a reference to Wilf, which for a second I was worried that they might have cut him out of the specials because he couldn't finish filming, but luckily it was just a fake out joke. Obviously this is then followed by a huge action scene between Unit, the Wrath and Meep, where the Doctor draws some shields with his sonic, which I don't really like as much as the heads up display, but at least it takes him some time to draw them so it isn't too overpowered, and once again it just kind of shows the big budget of this special. And before that, we also get my favourite moment in the whole episode.
Something smells nice.
Tuna madras.
So our main characters escape this epic sequence in Sean's taxi, which although being shot at by the Wrath is completely fine, which at first I thought was a bit weird and convenient, but luckily this was intentional, because this, along with the unit soldiers only being stunned and not killed, was on purpose, as the Wrath weren't trying to kill anybody, just trying to retrieve the Meep as their prisoner without any casualties. So that was a nice little explanation as to what seemed like a bit of a plot hole or plot convenience. So the final act of this special is the Meep trying to escape in their ship, which would destroy London because of the way it intakes fuel, and obviously the Doctor goes onto the ship to stop the Meep, which we then get the moment where Donna leaves her family to go and help him, calling him the Doctor, which Sylvia notices and is significant as nobody has called him the Doctor all episode, as Sylvia was worried about bringing Donna's memories back and her dying. So it's a nice way of showing that Donna is starting to remember who the Doctor is, or just that in her subconscious she knows she needs to help him. So she obviously joins the Doctor on the ship, but they're then separated and the Doctor can't access all the controls that he needs to stop the Meep, and he also doesn't doesn't have enough time to tell Donna what to do on the other side, which I think was a really great excuse to have Donna's memories be brought back by the Doctor and to have the Doctor Donna back. So the Doctor brings Donna's memories back with this kind of Winter Soldier-esque code word type thing, which I thought was a nice little touch, and we find out that Donna only has 55 seconds to live, which doesn't have as big of an impact as it could have because we know she's going to be in future episodes of the specials because of the trailers. But at least they don't try and make it too big of an emotional moment when she dies, because I guess they knew that we knew this wasn't the end for her. And we get an explanation as to the reason that she doesn't die, and it's because the meta crisis that was in Donna has been shared between Donna and her daughter Rose, which I think was a really clever way of resolving that issue and explaining why she hasn't been killed by remembering who the Doctor is. However, I do personally think relating it to Rose's gender does make it a lot more complex than it needs to be, and the non-binary line relating to binary feels a little bit clunky to me, and it also doesn't really make too much sense because Rose is portrayed as being a trans woman, not non-binary in this episode, so I do feel like it was just making it a little bit too complex for what it needed to be, and I would have been perfectly happy for it to just be because Rose is Donna's daughter, so the meta crisis was inherited and split between the two of them. The other problem I have at this point in the story is Russell's reliance on what I like to call the big friendly reset button. Obviously it makes sense that whatever they do in the ship kind of stops what the Meep is trying to do and stops the ship from taking off, but I'm not a big fan of the cracks in the ground kind of closing up and fixing themselves. I think it would have been cool to just kind of leave the cracks there, but I guess maybe that could become a problem for episodes in the future because they'd have to explain that later on down the line. And finally, another problem I had with this moment is the way the meta crisis thing is resolved, because obviously although it was shared between Donna and Rose, they still had that meta crisis in both of them, and that's something that they kind of couldn't have continue in for the next couple of episodes, or they didn't want to continue for the next couple of episodes. But I feel like the explanation of them just letting it go felt very unsatisfying, and the explanation feels very clunky and forced, and it kind of just makes you think why Donna hasn't done this already, and the explanation as to why the Doctor hasn't thought about this before just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And yeah, like I said, letting go of the meta crisis just doesn't feel like a satisfying end to that whole arc from series 4, and just feels like a bit of a cop-out to me. However, like I said, it does mean it's something that we don't have to worry about for the next couple of episodes, and maybe Russell just didn't want that part running throughout all the specials and needed to get it wrapped up here, because it also means we don't basically have two Doctors running around for all the specials. But like I said, I feel like it was just done way too quick and not in a very satisfying way. So just before the Meep is being taken away by the Roth Warriors, they make a reference to somebody called the Boss, which sounds very vague and generic of a hint or threat, and does kind of come across as a little bit of weak writing. However, I do think it works a little bit better because of the Doctor's cryptic "I hate that" line that comes afterwards. We're then finally introduced to the brand new TARDIS interior, which I think looks great. I love the moment it's revealed as well, especially with David Tennant as the 14th Doctor running around it and doing basically a lap around the TARDIS, giddy with excitement, just like a child would be. As for the interior itself, I really love it. I think it's one of the best TARDIS interiors I've ever seen, possibly the best, but there's definitely a few things, like a few other people have said, that could improve it, like some bits of furniture and decoration here and there, which I assume we're probably going to get when Ncuti takes over the TARDIS. I'd hope so anyway. But even without that, I love it. It looks really big and expansive, and I love the fact that the lights can change to any colour and do all these different movements and stuff like that. And obviously the episode ends with a cliffhanger with Donna spilling coffee on the TARDIS, which is very in character. Overall, I think this episode was pretty good. I had a really fun time with it, and it was very fast paced and felt very large scale and big budget, which makes sense given all the Disney money. But obviously, like I said, I do have a few problems with it, specifically towards the final act and some of the explanations around the meta-crisis stuff, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy this episode. Okay, so a lot of people were very excited for this special and had a lot of high expectations for this episode, expecting a lot of surprise cameos and a lot more, mainly down to its secrecy in terms of the marketing, which may have been not the best decision from the team, which Russell has acknowledged himself.
I think that might have had an unfortunate effect. I think everyone's expecting Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi and the ghost of William Hartnell riding on the back of the Garm.
But personally, for me, for this episode, I just wanted something kind of weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion in there. Something a little bit like Series 4's Midnight, and luckily, that's exactly what we got for this episode. So this episode starts with a cold open with Isaac Newton under the apple tree, and I seem to be the only one who liked this cold open from what I've seen at least. I know a lot of people have complained about how pointless and unnecessary it feels, which is true, but for me personally, I honestly don't really see why that matters. It doesn't necessarily have to have much of a point to it, and it's just a bit of a fun scene that's setting up a running joke with the episode, and a nice way to kind of make you feel kind of comfortable before the episode gets really scary and weird, which I think just really adds to the impact of the scary and weird stuff in this episode.
You can appreciate
the gravity of the situation.
So I love the opening of this episode proper, with the Doctor and Donna exploring the ship, and also the fact that the TARDIS leaves with the Sonic I thought was a really good touch, because it means they not only don't have the TARDIS to escape, but the Doctor also doesn't have his Sonic, which we now know is significantly upgraded from the past. I think the ship looks really great for the most part, especially the small practical rooms, the actual sets that were used in this episode, and the huge expansive CGI corridor was really cool. I've seen a few people say that this part of the ship looks pretty bad, and while I don't completely disagree, I think for the most part it looks pretty good, but there are some parts where the CGI and like the green screen of that corridor setting, such as when they're running and stuff like that, does look a little bit bad, and the keying of the green screen is a little bit too obvious, which is a shame, but like I said, for the most part I actually thought it looked pretty good. And yeah, this whole opening bit with the Doctor and Donna is very reminiscent of something like the Ark in Space from classic Doctor Who, which is one I've actually seen, where they're just trying to figure out where everyone is and what's going on, and there's a few mysteries introduced for the episode as well, with the different words being said over the tannoy and the clanging they hear every now and then, as well as them finding out that the airlock opened and closed 3 years ago, and also the fact that Jimbo, the cute little robot, is walking one step at a time every now and then when we hear the words. So then we're introduced to the main villains of the story, which people are dubbing the Not Things, and I think the introduction of these villains was really well done. For a second, I thought we were just kind of having a little jump cut that was kind of skipping us ahead in time whilst they were finishing off this task that they were doing in separate rooms, until we then cut back and see that there's actually two versions of the Doctor and Donna in each of the rooms, and none of our characters know about it, and I think it was just really, really well done for that introduction, especially when we didn't know what the villain or the threat of this episode was going to be, which is one of the benefits of it being so secretive. And you can say what you want about what the creatures look like and some of the effects of the creatures, which I'll get to later on, but the initial line before all that happens of "my arms are too long,"
My arm's too long.
it was just so creepy, and such a creepy line to have in the show, and worked very effectively, especially the delivery of this line from both of the characters, with just how calmly and nonchalantly they say it, and the fact that they have to repeat it multiple times before our characters even click what is going on. And the concept of these creatures is a really great idea, very reminiscent of The Thing, and also quite reminiscent of that story Midnight, which I was talking about earlier on, which is what I wanted this episode to be like. And this concept also allows for some great character work and acting from Tennant and Tate in this episode. So I think the practical effects of the Not Things, such as the big long arms and the double knee and stuff like that, I think looks great. And the CGI in some points actually looks really good as well, but there were a few points with the CGI, such as the Snapchat filter or Miss Evangelista type face effects, as well as the Not Thing Doctor sticking his head out from underneath his legs, that I personally thought didn't look the best. And like I said earlier as well, some of the moments where they're running down the corridor, the CGI looks pretty bad as well, or is at least a bit noticeable where it shouldn't be. There's a few moments in here as well where the Doctor and Donna obviously inevitably get separated and don't know whether they're talking to their Not Thing self or the real self. And one of these situations we get a little reference to the Timeless Children and the Flux. We finally have acknowledgement that the Flux has destroyed half the universe and that it hasn't been fixed or reset, which is something that Chibnall didn't even bother to do in his own era, which was something that really annoyed me about the Flux. And we also get to see more emotion from the Doctor and more of a reaction from the Doctor about the Timeless Children stuff than we also got in Chibnall's era, which isn't like Jodie's fault or anything. It's more Chibnall not writing a scene like this for Jodie in that era, which I think was a really missed opportunity, so I'm glad that we got that in this. So then we find out that the Not Things basically learn things from the characters the faster they do stuff, and that's the reason they're trying to scare them, to get their adrenaline pumping and to get them thinking so that they can copy them even faster and even better, which leads to this great moment where the Doctor, wanting to solve all these mysteries, is told that he needs to stop thinking so that the Not Things can't evolve and become more like them. But obviously he just really wants to think and try and solve all these mysteries that have been set up earlier on in the episode, which he eventually ends up doing. And so that reveals these few mysteries that we had at the start of the episode, with the clanging being the captain floating in space,
Rehab was supposed to be a fresh start.
which also explains the airlock being opened and closed 3 years ago. We find out the words are actually a countdown, they're actually the numbers of the language that these aliens spoke, which I think was really well done because the Doctor initially shrugs off the possibility of a countdown early on. And we also find out the reason that Jimbo, the robot, was walking so slowly was because it was slowly walking towards this self-destruct button that the captain had set up and made to go slowly so that the Not Things couldn't figure out what was going on. And the conclusion to this story, initially I was a little bit confused confused, and it did feel a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina of sorts, but it does actually kind of make sense when you think about it and kind of realize what it means and what's actually going on, because the TARDIS would obviously know if the Not Things aren't going to be able to reach Jimbo in time to stop the countdown, which is what is about to happen. The TARDIS would obviously realize that and be able to show up early enough to pick up the Doctor and Donna. But obviously then the Doctor picks up the wrong Donna in a great moment where he asks them the question that was set up earlier on about Mrs. Bean, asking them the question why that name is funny, and he ends up taking the Donna that says because it just is, because he obviously thinks that's more like what Donna would say, but this ends up actually being the wrong Donna, which I think is great because it kind of shows that although that would make sense and that is what I was thinking in my head, I was like, yeah, that would be the right Donna, it shows that maybe that would have been initially what the real Donna was thinking, but she probably thought that wasn't a good enough answer for the Doctor and probably overthought the question a little bit, which ultimately led to her not being taken by the Doctor and the Doctor not believing that she was the real one, which led to a great showcase of Catherine Tate's acting ability in this episode when she's shouting for the Doctor to come back because he's taken the wrong one. And then we get another fake out death with Catherine Tate, although this one works significantly better than the fake out death in the Star Beast, because they almost didn't play that one in the Star Beast seriously and give it enough weight to make it feel real, maybe because they knew that we knew she was going to be in future episodes. But in here they really play it as if it is actually about to happen, and even though we know she's going to be in the Giggle, for a second I still genuinely thought she might die here and maybe be replaced by her Not Thing counterpart or something like that, and I was genuinely on the edge of my seat from what I remember, like I was literally on the edge of my seat. But obviously the Doctor then realizes in the TARDIS, I think by scanning the Not Thing Donna, that she is in fact the Not Thing Donna, not the real Donna, which I do feel like was a little bit unsatisfying, a way of him realizing that that wasn't the real Donna, because it isn't actually about him kind of figuring it out himself. He just kind of scans her on the TARDIS and realizes that one of her arms is too long or something like that. So I think that could have been done slightly better. But obviously after doing this, the real Donna is then reunited with the Doctor in the TARDIS and they go back home, but they're maybe a day or two late according to the Doctor, which leads them to arriving exactly where they just left, but this time Wilfred Mott is there to greet them. And for those who don't know, Wilf is probably my favourite character in all of Doctor Who, and so I was so happy to see him. I knew he was going to be in this, I just didn't know exactly when we were going to see him, but I'm so glad we finally did, even if this is going to be his only appearance in the specials, which has been alluded to. The fact that this is the scene that they managed to film with him is just so great, because it was such a great scene and such a great moment between him and the Doctor and Donna, and the perfect scene for his reappearance in the show, because now we finally at least know that he knows Donna remembers these things now, he can talk to Donna about it, and he finally gets to see the Doctor in the same face that he remembers once again. Like I said, I think it was the perfect scene to have of him in this special, and I'm just so grateful that we actually got to have this scene and this moment in these specials, and it's just great to see Wilf and Bernard Cribbins again, obviously. And then this leads to a great cliffhanger to the next episode, The Giggle, where we just kind of see everyone going crazy, which, you know, doesn't give too much away and just perfectly sets everything up. Really feels like there's high stakes going into this next episode straight from the get-go, and I just can't wait to see where this leads us to. So, like I said at the start of this video, although we were expecting a little bit more from this episode, or at least some people were, all I personally wanted from this was something weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion, and like I said, something a little bit like Midnight from Series 4, and obviously, like I said, that's exactly what we got, and I loved it. The character work in this was great, whether that be between the Doctor and Donna, or them and their Not Thing counterparts. I do think this episode works a lot better on the page. It's perfect on the page, and it works almost perfectly in the execution, because like I said, the practical effects look great, but obviously some of the CGI was a little bit ropey in there, but for me it still kind of works just because of how weird it was. So I thought the Toymaker was really good in this episode. I haven't seen the original story, and obviously a lot of it is missing, so I don't really know what he's meant to be like, but I do know that original story isn't meant to be that good anyway from what I've heard. But I did think the Toymaker was really good in this. Probably the only complaint I really have is I do feel like he should have dropped that German accent a little bit sooner than he did, or been speaking mostly in that British accent for most of the time, because it did start to get a little bit annoying after a bit, and I thought he was going to drop the accent when the Doctor immediately recognises him, or first recognises him in the toy shop, which he doesn't, but I do feel like that would have been a lot better if he had done that. I know the accent is meant to be purposefully bad, but it still gets a little bit annoying throughout the episode. I think the Toymaker's realm was really well visualized in this story. Obviously, it's not something they could have really done this well in the 60s, and so the visuals of that endless corridor and the black void that they're in, I think was visualized really well, and a nice updated version of the Toymaker's realm. And I also liked the companion puppet show that the Toymaker put on for the Doctor and Donna, to show Donna what had happened with the Doctor's companions since she left. I've seen a lot of people complaining complaining about this, saying there's no mention of Chibnall era companions. But to me, that's really obvious that it's because those characters didn't die, like the characters the Toymaker is talking about. Obviously, I know those characters didn't actually die, and that's what the Doctor is saying, but that's obviously the reason these companions were chosen. And there is still a mention to Flux in there, so it's not like Chibnall Erasure or something like that. And I obviously really liked the creepy puppet scenes, especially the one with the Doctor, with the puppet of the guy we see in the cold open, and the puppet of himself. But obviously also I really liked the creepy scene between Donna and Stooky Sue and the Stooky babies, which I think was really creepy as well. But personally, I think the bits with the Doctor in that moment worked a lot better. And obviously, whilst we're still on the topic of the Toymaker, I really liked the Spice Up Your Life scene. It was really creepy, especially with David Tennant playing it straight as the Doctor when those unit soldiers die. It just really shows how crazy the Toymaker is, because he's just having so much fun with this when people are dying. In terms of the actual Giggle plot that is throughout this episode, the thing that this episode is named after, I think it was really well set up with the post-titles scene, and even the cold open with John Logie Baird, who I thought was going to feature a little bit more in this episode than he did, but I'll get onto that later. But yeah, the Giggle plot was really well set up with the scene after the title sequence, where we see the effect it's having on the general population of Earth, and it was also really well set up with the scenes at Unit in the first half, with some great commentary on society and the government, and obviously the anti-vax allegory with Trinity Wells, which I think was really well done. But the problem I have with the Giggle plot is that it seems to basically take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Donna travel back to 1925 and confront the Toymaker, and from that point on it just feels a little bit disconnected from the rest of the plot, and I think it's really unfortunate that we don't get to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that post-title scene that I talked about earlier. And I think for that reason this episode could have benefited a little bit from being either 2 parts, or what I personally think would have been better is if it was a 90-minute episode like The Power of the Doctor, because that would have just given us more time to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that one scene at the start of the episode. Obviously, Unit are in this episode, and they have the brand new Unit HQ, which looks a bit like Stark Tower or Avengers Tower, which I think looked really good. And they also have the Vlinx, which is a robot-type alien creature in there, which isn't really explained as to why he's there. But for me personally, what I think that is they're just trying to fill out the Unit roster for a potential spin-off in the future, similar to Mr. Smith in Sarah Jane Adventures. And speaking of Unit, it's great to see some of the returning characters. Obviously, we get to see Kate Stewart in this episode, who gets a really good moment when she takes the Z-Dex off, or deactivates her Z-Dex to show the effects of the Giggle, and it's just really nice to see her written by RTD, and I can't wait to see her return in the future with Ncuti Gatwa. This also leads to a nice moment with Shirley, which shuts down the complaints of the bigots that they had in the Star Beast, who basically just don't understand that disability is a spectrum, and were basically accusing Ruth Madeley of not being disabled, which is just insane. So I'm glad that that was in there. It's almost like Russell predicted that that was going to happen, those complaints were going to be made by bigots, and so that moment just works really well for that. And we also get a nice moment with Mel when she first sees the Doctor again, and the Doctor first recognises her after almost not noticing her immediately, which I think was a really good way of doing it. But unfortunately, although these characters have these nice moments at the start, they don't actually end up doing a whole lot in the episode, because they kind of get sidelined for the second half. Because like I alluded to earlier, once the Doctor and Donna go back to 1925 to confront the Toymaker, the whole Giggle plot kind of takes a back seat from the rest of the plot, and these characters' appearances kind of suffer with that as well, which I think is really unfortunate. But like I said, I enjoyed the moments we got with them in this episode, and I think they were really good. I just wish we would have been able to see more of them, and that as well could have been a benefit of having this episode be 90 minutes long or a 2-parter or something like that. Okay, so obviously this is the last episode of these specials with the 14th Doctor, at least as the main Doctor in the show. So he obviously regenerates in this episode. And for me personally, I quite liked this regeneration. I really liked how sudden the regeneration was. The Doctor was basically like mid-sentence when he gets shot by the galvanic beam by the Toymaker, which I think was really good and felt kind of shocking and sudden, especially with how much left of the episode we had. Obviously with Ten's regeneration, back in the End of Time Part 2, it ended with him alone in the TARDIS saying, "I don't want to go," which is quite a controversial line, which at the time I liked, but the more I think about that line, the more I realise it's a little bit unfair on the next Doctor, which at the time was Matt Smith, so it isn't my favourite final line of a Doctor. But with 14's regeneration, who is obviously also David Tennant, he regenerates surrounded by friends like Donna and Mel, who are right by his side, which I think was really nice. And instead of saying "I don't want to go," he says "it's time" and "allons-y," which obviously means "let's go" in French. So I just really liked that contrast of the 14th Doctor and the 10th Doctor's final lines, which was something I was really hoping for in this episode. And as well as that, we also got some nice references to previous classic regenerations in this moment as well, with the Doctor saying, "Here we go again," which is a reference to the third Doctor's regeneration, and him saying it feels different this time just before the bi-generation, which is a nice reference to the fifth Doctor's regeneration in Caves of Androzani. Now we're getting on to the bit that you're probably all here for, the bi-generation in this episode, a brand new addition to Doctor Who canon basically, in terms of Time Lord regeneration mechanics and stuff like that. Now I had seen the leak before this episode, unfortunately, although I had only read it once and I didn't read it again like really close to the episode or anything, so I didn't remember the exact details, but I had read the leak. And while I didn't like the idea on paper of the leak, I do feel like the execution of this concept and this bi-generation was a lot better than I expected it to be from reading the leak itself. It allows us to have a multi-Doctor story for the 60th anniversary specials in a way that we've not seen before, with a future Doctor meeting our current Doctor instead of a past Doctor, which I think was a really interesting thing to do. And seeing David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa on screen together was really good, and I think they had really good chemistry. And I also seem to be the only person that liked the catch scene in this episode. I just thought it was a really fun conclusion to the episode and a really fun way to beat the Toymaker. And a lot of people seem to be complaining about this idea, being confused as to why the Toymaker isn't able to just catch a ball because of how powerful he is. But this is explained earlier on in the episode with the fact that the Toymaker doesn't cheat. That's the one thing he basically doesn't do. He plays by the rules.
The only rules the Toymaker follows are the rules of the game. They bind his entire existence.
But with that being said, I really don't like this line.
Do you come in a range of colours?
I also like the scene with the 14th Doctor having a meal with Donna and her family at the end of the episode. I think it was a really well executed and emotional scene, and David Tennant was just great in that moment. And overall, this bi-generation idea, this concept, was a nice and interesting way of concluding this era and passing the torch to not only Ncuti Gatwa, but just to a brand new era of the show in general. However, although I thought the bi-generation thing as a whole was really well executed, I still don't know how I feel about the concept in the first place. Obviously, this means that the 14th Doctor is still around, which I'm not sure how I feel about. It feels very similar to the end of Journey's End, with the Meta-Crisis Doctor going to live his life with Rose in the parallel universe, and it just really makes it seem like RTD really wants to just keep his favourite Doctor around as much as possible. And I really think the 14th Doctor shouldn't have kept his own TARDIS at the end of the episode, because that just invites him to return in the future and also makes him equal to the 15th Doctor, which just slightly undermines the 15th Doctor a little bit in my eyes. And I really hope and don't think that this is setting up a 14 and Donna spin-off, as it would just be too similar to the main show, and some people would just kind of be treating this as like, this is real Doctor Who, and Ncuti Gatwa isn't real Doctor Who, and I just don't think that would be fair. But I do think that maybe 14 and Donna will appear often in maybe like the unit spin-off that they seem to be setting up with the Vlinks. I just hope they don't get a spin-off of their own, because I don't think that would be fair. And to add on to that, I just think the optics of this, from a conceptual standpoint, just isn't great, because it just kind of gives ammunition for certain people to say that Ncuti Gatwa isn't the real Doctor and the real Doctor is still out there somewhere in the 14th Doctor, which I just think is a little bit unfair on Ncuti Gatwa, and it's not great optics for the first black main Doctor. But talking about Ncuti Gatwa, I think he was really good in this episode. Right from the outset, I really enjoyed him, and they do try to give him as many of the Doctor's lines as possible once he's introduced in this episode, although he does still feel somewhat overshadowed by David Tennant being there, especially with this being the 14th Doctor's story, and they still need to conclude the 14th Doctor's story in this episode. But I can't wait to see him as the full-time Doctor at Christmas and next year in season 1 or series 14 or whatever we're calling it. And obviously also at the end of the episode we get a little hint to the Master returning, with the fingers picking up the golden tooth that the Master is supposedly trapped in, which I personally think this was just meant to be a bit of a jokey moment from RTD, a nice little reference back to series 3 where this also happened, and I don't think there's any immediate plans to bring back the character anytime soon, or at least I hope not, because I think the Master needs a break for a little bit before they bring him back, and I really hope Anya and Barnard is not playing him in season 1, because that seems like that concept will just be too similar to the whole Saxon arc in series 3. So overall, I really enjoyed this episode for the most part. I'm still not 100% sure how I feel about the bi-generation, just as a concept to begin with in this episode. Although, like I said, I do feel like it was really well executed in this episode. And the more I think about this episode, the more I like it, which is basically the opposite of how I feel about the Star Beast. Basically, the Star Beast, to the most part, I liked as an episode, but the more I think about the ending of that episode, the more I dislike it. While Blue Yonder, I've been pretty solid on, like, I love that episode. There's a few dodgy VFX in there, but for the most part, I think it's really good. And this episode I really enjoyed, and the more I think about it, the more I like it. So that's kind of how I feel overall about the specials. For that reason, I think I'd put the Star Beast at probably a low B tier, possibly even C tier. I'd easily put Wild Blue Yonder at A ranking, and I think I'd put the Giggle at a high B on the tier list. For the first time since 2017, we got a Doctor Who Christmas special with The Church on Ruby Road. This episode sees the introduction of the brand new 15th Doctor, as well as companion Ruby Sunday. But was this episode good? Okay, so the first time I watched The Church on Ruby Road, I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, possibly because I was watching it with family and couldn't give it my full attention. I didn't love it, nor did I hate it, but I was leaning more towards not liking it after the first viewing. But after rewatching it a couple days later, I liked it a lot more. Obviously, the main thing about this episode is Ncuti Gatwa as the 15th Doctor.
I'm the Doctor.
Who I really liked in the role straight away. He feels like the Doctor immediately and is really likeable, and I liked how much more emotionally open this Doctor is, especially in comparison to the 13th Doctor, who was quite emotionally closed off. However, I don't feel like Ncuti has had his Doctor moment yet. It comes close with the scene that was requested by Disney, where he's talking to that police officer.
If you don't mind, I just got snowman and I would like to go home.
But I still don't feel like he's had his proper Doctor moment yet. But I'm sure he'll get that somewhere in season 1, probably in the first episode. Speaking of the Disney requested scene, I'm not sure how I felt about this scene, because although I really liked it and I thought Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor was great in it, I do feel like it would have had much more of an impact if we didn't see the Doctor properly until he first properly introduces himself to Ruby on the ladder, as was originally intended. But like I said, I did really like him in that scene, so I'm a little bit conflicted there. As for the other brand new main character we got in this episode, Ruby Sunday, I really liked her as well. This is more of Ruby's episode than the Doctor's episode, which makes sense as it's meant to be similar to episodes like Rose, where we follow the story through the companion's point of view and are introduced to them before we're introduced to the Doctor. I also really like Ruby's family. I'm glad RTD is bringing back the domestic aspects of the show that he did so well in his first era, and having a companion's family that we can relate to and get to know over time. I think her relationship with Carla is great, and I love how close they are, especially when we see what Carla's life would be like without Ruby towards the end of the episode.
Why would I want a daughter when I'm happy as I am?
Then why are you crying?
And also, of course, Ruby's grandmother, Cherry. I think she was the best character in the whole episode. She was absolutely hilarious, and I can't wait to see her in future episodes. I've said this before in another video, but I seem to be the only person who actually likes the new sonic screwdriver design. It's a nice, refreshing design, and anyone who's complaining about it not looking like a screwdriver, as if the past few Sonics really looked anything like a screwdriver either, are coping really hard. The intelligent gloves, not psychic gloves, as Ncuti said, were a cool addition to the episode. Their introduction in the story, both when they're on the ladder and when they escape the Goblin's ship, is a really clever and organic way to set up the conclusion to this story. Obviously, in this episode as well, we have the Goblins and the Goblin King, which I think were a very interesting and unique addition to the show, helped by the Toymaker paving the way for more supernatural villains like this. And for that reason, I liked how they worked differently to anything we've seen before. It allows for the Doctor to have some fun moments of excitement and joy as he figures out how their technology works. Obviously, we also have the Goblin song in this episode. I had heard the Goblin song before the episode aired, and honestly was dreading watching that moment with my family.
He's the Goblin King, yes, the Goblin King. He's not a myth, he's an actual thing.
And at the time of watching it on Christmas Day, I did feel quite embarrassed and didn't like it on first viewing. But I think this is mostly just because I was watching it with other people and feeling embarrassed. But after rewatching the episode, I think the Goblin song fits very well with the rest of the episode. And I even like when the Doctor and Ruby join in with the singing. However, I do think this moment would have worked a lot better if we didn't already know the song was going to be in the episode and didn't get to hear the song beforehand. The main problem I have with the Goblins and the Goblin King in this episode is they do take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Ruby escape the Goblin ship. We do now know from the commentary that there was meant to be a scene where the Doctor and Ruby fight off the Goblins and the Goblin King in Ruby's flat, but this was cut for budgetary reasons, so that could explain why it does feel a bit weird and feel like they're missing for quite a lot of the episode. And it just kind of makes them feel a little bit absent from the episode and almost like they're just working in the background. With that being said though, I really liked the moments in the flat between the Doctor, Ruby and Carla, so I can't really complain because it just means we got more of that, but it does affect the pacing a little bit with how long we don't see the Goblins for and just know that they're up there somewhere until we get to see them again at the end. Speaking of the end, the final act at the church, like I said earlier on, I liked how well and seamlessly the intelligent gloves were set up earlier on in the episode. It makes the payoff of this moment a lot more effective and climactic, and it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere. And like I said, it just feels like a payoff. However, I do feel like it feels somewhat out of character for the Doctor to just Simon Skinner that Goblin. without at least trying to negotiate with them or something first. But with that being said, they do eat babies and tried to abduct Ruby and eat her as a baby, so maybe it's somewhat justified. It also feels a bit weird that the goblin ship just disappears, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that on my first viewing. But then again, the goblins are a new supernatural monster that we haven't previously had in the show and are only here thanks to the toy maker. It does also feel weird that the Doctor doesn't follow the woman who abandoned Ruby at the church, but to be honest, this moment is something we'll likely return to at some point in season 1, as it's probably a big part of the overarching storyline. Also, I haven't yet talked about Davina McCall in this episode. I think she was a fun guest star to have in a Christmas special, but honestly, her acting's not the best, which is fair enough because she is a presenter by trade. I think her death in this episode was a good way to show how much of a threat the goblins can be, and that they're not just slightly mischievous and eating babies. In a normal episode, I probably wouldn't really like the moment where the Doctor goes back to save her from the Christmas tree at the end, but because this is a Christmas special, I think it works just fine. However, I'm a bit unsure of how the Doctor knew about what happened to Davina in the first place. I guess we just have to assume that Ruby told him when they were tied up or something like that, or when they were going up the ladder. Maybe there's a deleted scene for that somewhere or something. And obviously, finally, this episode ends with Mrs. Flood breaking the fourth wall directly to the camera about asking if you've never seen a TARDIS before.
Never seen a TARDIS before.
Which I did feel like was a little bit weird and out of place, but I guess we'll just have to see what her character turns out to be in the future. Maybe this is just something she does and we don't quite know who she is yet, but even with that being said, it did feel a little bit weird and out of place. And at the very end of this episode, we got a first look at Doctor Who Season 1, airing in May 2024, with a very short trailer. If you want to see what details we can glean from that trailer, I've made a whole breakdown for that trailer, which will be on screen now.